Hi, my name is Sarah Ludlow, and I work for the Nature Conservancy of Canada in Regina, Saskatchewan. And today I just wanted to go over some tips on how to identify birds. So identifying birds to species is often a process of elimination, where we work through various characteristics to continually narrow down the options for which species of bird it is that you're looking at. Eventually, with enough practice, certain birds become familiar and you don't need to work through this process of elimination to figure out what they are. You'll just know what they are when you see them. So good examples of these are pigeons. Everybody knows what a pigeon is when you see it. Also, the more you go through this process, the better and faster you become at it. So it does get easier over time. And keep in mind that most people generally know and are already able to accurately identify way more species of birds than they realize. So there are four main things to consider when you're trying to identify a bird, and using these as a sort of checklist will help you navigate the process of elimination and get an identification. So these four things to look for are size and shape, color, behavior, and habitat. So I'll spend some time going over each of these and elaborate on what I mean by them. So many times beginner birders get stuck on bird ID because they're focusing on the colors first. In some cases, this can be helpful, excuse me. So if you have a bluebird, it's really obvious what it is. But in many cases, it's not. So if you've got a bunch of birds that are all brown, like sparrows or female ducks, it can be a bit trickier. So instead, start with determining the size and shape of the bird you're trying to identify. Once you have that nailed down, then pay attention to the color. So ask yourself, what shape is the bird you're trying to identify? One easy way to do this is looking at the bird as a silhouette. So silhouettes let you quickly determine the size, posture, proportions, and help you narrow down what type of bird you are looking at. And this can help you know which section to go to in your field guide. It gives you a place to start. So the next question to ask yourself is how big is the bird you're trying to identify? Size is trickier than shape because it's often dependent on context and how big that bird is relative to nearby objects. And this can get tricky if you don't know how big those objects are. So another option is to compare the bird you're looking at to that size of other birds nearby. And of course, if the bird's by itself, that doesn't work so well. But let's say there's other birds around. You can compare it to how big they are or compare it to the general size of common birds. So sparrows, robins, and crows are good ones. And use these birds that you do know the size of as a ruler for the ones that you don't. So once you've determined the size and the shape of the bird as a whole, determine the size and shape of various body parts. For example, how big is the bill and what shape is it? How long are the legs? What shape are the wings and the tail? Bill shape can be a key feature to help you narrow down which group of birds your mystery bird belongs to. Does it have a long bill for probing the mud like a sandpiper? A wide, thick bill for cracking seeds like a sparrow or grosbeak? Or does it have a sharp, hooked bill for tearing flesh like a hawk or an owl? Another useful thing to do is to compare the bird against itself. For example, how long is the bird's bill relative to its head? How big is its head relative to the rest of its body? A good example of this is when you're trying to determine if you're looking at a hairy or a downy woodpecker, which are very similar in color, and they also overlap in habitat. They do differ in size. However, this isn't helpful if they're not sitting beside each other. So this is where comparing the size of the bird to nearby objects like a feeder is helpful, or if there are no useful objects nearby, or you don't know what size they are, comparing the bird to itself. That's where this comes in handy. So in this case, the bill of a downy woodpecker is only about half as long as its head, while the bill of the hairy woodpecker is about the same length as its head. So when I'm looking at one of these woodpeckers and trying to use this tool to figure out which one it is, I imagine taking the bird's bill and folding it back onto the head. So where does that bill land? Does it land just past the eye, where it'd be a bit shorter like the downy, or does it always go to the back of the head? That would make it a hairy. So that's how I do that. But yeah, so just divide the bird into proportions and see length of bill versus length of head. So next, after you've determined the size and shape, then you pay attention to the color and pattern of the bird, or lack thereof. So which areas of its body are dark and which are light? Sometimes the lighting out in the field is not conducive to actually determining what color a bird is. However, if you know which parts are dark versus which parts are light, you can still use that information to help you identify your bird. For example, the boodio hawks, so Swainson's and red-tailed hawks, are similar in size and they're similar colors. However, the distribution of the color on the front or underside of the bird is different in each of these species. So you don't need to know what the color is exactly, just which parts are dark or where there are dark areas on the body. So if we look at this specific example of these two hawks, you'll notice the Swainson's hawk's head is dark and extends all the way down to the top of the breast. Meanwhile, the red-tailed hawk, the dark does not go down that far. It stops and doesn't go down to the breast. So just noticing that difference is one easy way. And you'll notice just looking at these two pictures, there's lots of other differences in where the light versus dark are on the bird. So you don't necessarily need to know what color they are specifically. So in addition, pay attention to other field marks related to color and or pattern. So field marks are features on a bird or other animal that can be used to help identify it. And some good examples of field marks are streaking, color patches, eye rings, wing bars, patterns of white or color on the tail, and the list goes on. So it's things that stand out and make that bird identifiable by that feature. So again, more questions to ask yourself are, is there streaking on the breast? If yes, how far down the breast does it extend? How heavy is that streaking? So in this example, I have 3 sparrows. You'll notice that the song sparrow has quite heavy streaking and it extends down from the top of the breast, about partway down to the belly, and it does go down the sides. The Lincoln sparrow, on the other hand, the streaking is a lot finer and it doesn't go down as far on the breast. And then we look at the swamp sparrow. You could argue that this bird doesn't really have streaking. So paying attention to that feature and then fine-tuning the details on it are an easy way to help you eliminate birds. If we saw a bird with no streaking, we could immediately eliminate the song sparrow and the Lincoln sparrow and only look at the sparrows without streaking on their breast. So again, what color are the legs or the bill? So this is useful for shorebirds or large wading birds. Example I have here is of egrets. So the great egret has black legs and a yellow bill. The snowy egret has black legs and a black bill. And the cattle egret has yellow legs and a yellow bill. These birds all differ in size, but again, unless they're all together, that's only so useful. So just making note of what color the bill are and what color the legs are, that can really quickly get you down to an ID. One fun fact, the snowy egret, they've got that black legs and that black bill, but their feet are bright yellow. So it looks like they're wearing golden gloves. So once you've sort of looked at the main broad colors of the bird, are there any other obvious features that you notice? Does it have white outer tail feathers? Does it have an eye ring? Wing bars? So this example here is of thrushes. So we could use the presence or absence of an eye ring in this situation as one field mark to help us distinguish which species it is that we're looking at. So the Swainson's thrush has a bold eye ring that goes all the way around its eye, whereas the gray cheek thrush does not. So if you're looking at a thrush, that would be one way you could help distinguish which species it is, and again, eliminate the ones that don't match the criteria for the bird you're looking at. And then sometimes it's the lack of obvious field marks that is the most informative. For example, using our process of elimination, we could eliminate all the birds in this example that have one specific field mark if our mystery bird does not have it. So here we have 4 grassland sparrows, and let's say the bird we observed has no streaking on its breast. Immediately we could eliminate the savanna, vesper, and Baird sparrows because they all have streaking on their breasts in varying degrees and heaviness. Whereas clay-colored sparrow does not. So that's a really quick elimination of, 3/4 of the species that we had as options. Of course, some birds are brightly colored, and this makes them really easy to identify. It really helps narrow it down. So examples of this would be bluebirds, rose-breasted grosbeaks, yellow-headed blackbirds, goldfinches. And the reason they're so distinct is that there's really nothing else that looks like them. So These guys are nice to come across. They're pretty and they're nice and easy to identify. So the third criteria I'm going to talk about is behavior. So often paying attention to what the bird is doing or how it is behaving can help you figure out what species you're looking at. To use behavior to help you with identification, pay attention to the bird's posture. For example, is it sitting vertically and erect and straight on its perch, or is it more horizontal and like crouched down? Next, watch how the bird moves. Does it walk along the ground, or is it hopping? Is it moving up the tree, or is it moving down? And for ducks, is it dabbling with its butt in the air, or is it diving and going completely under the water? All these things can help you, again, narrow down your options for what species it is that you're looking at. So pay attention to what the bird's flight looks like. For example, does it seem bouncy? So the bird's going flap, flap, glide. Or does it fly straight because it's constantly flapping? The flight of some birds is quite distinctive, and this can be helpful in narrowing down your options for identification. For example, woodpeckers and finches both have that bouncy flight pattern, whereas sparrows fly straight with no bounces. So if you had a bird, again, let's say it's an American goldfinch, similar size to a sparrow, but you see it doing that like bouncy flap flap glide, you know you're looking at a finch of some sort versus a bird of similar size, excuse me, flying straight, you could eliminate the finches. Another thing to take note of is how the bird forages. So does it stay aloft and catch insects out of the air? Does it make quick little sallies from a branch to catch an insect and then go back to its perch? Does it dive into the water to catch fish? Again, with the ducks, does it dabble or does it dive for its food? Does it probe the mud for insects with its bill? A brief observation of how the bird is foraging can give useful insights and impressions of the bird, which can help you with identification. So the last behavioral cue to pay attention to is flocking. Is the bird in a group with other birds? And by this I mean, is it clear that the birds are choosing to be near one another, not just happening to be in the same area? Or is the bird by itself? So some species are gregarious, and this means they like to be with their friends, and are almost always with some other birds of the same species. Sometimes also they'll be in mixed species flocks, but they're going to be with other birds most of the time. Meanwhile, other species are solitary and will only be observed in pairs during the breeding season. So for example, if you saw a group of bright yellow birds in a tree, they're more likely to be a flock of American goldfinch than a yellow warbler, since the former is known to be more social and gregarious, while the latter is more solitary. So one thing to keep in mind is that many species do get more sociable towards the end of the breeding season. Territories break down and the birds begin to flock up before migration. So noting the time of year is important for this last behavioral cue. So the last broad criteria I'll talk about is habitat. Where you see a bird is often very helpful in determining which species it is that you're looking at. For example, song and vesper sparrows are similar looking. They both are brown sparrows with streaked breasts, similar size. They even have very similar songs. However, song sparrows are found in open woodlands and vegetation surrounding water bodies or wetlands, while vesper sparrows are found in open grassy areas and generally avoid wooded areas. So in this particular example, the habitat in which you observe the bird is very helpful in determining the identification. Sometimes habitat is the main criteria you can use to help you ID the bird. So for example, with this sparrow example, song sparrows and vespers have similar songs. And oftentimes when a bird is singing out in the field, you won't be able to actually see it, but you can hear it singing. So in this situation, making note of which type of habitat the song is coming from will help you distinguish which of these two birds is nearby. If I was walking through this field, open grassland with the fence, and I heard that song, I would 100% know it's a vesper sparrow. I wouldn't even consider it the option of the song sparrow. Contrast, if I was down in that coulee with the trees and the water, higher probability it's going to be a song sparrow when I hear that song, just based completely on the habitat that I'm in. Another useful piece of the identification puzzle are range maps. So most field guides include a map of each species' known range in the description for that species. And there is absolutely no necessity or expectation that you memorize these. You definitely always just look this up. Eventually, you will become more familiar with the range and the distribution of birds in your area. But yeah, definitely don't worry about memorizing these. And these are definitely a very handy resource to help you eliminate potential candidates when you're trying to ID a bird. Specifically, odds are that a species that usually occurs in the southern US and Mexico during the breeding season is not the species you're looking at in central Saskatchewan in mid-June. There are, of course, always exceptions. Birds don't read maps, and vagrants happen. However, vagrants are considered rare for a reason, and the probability is much higher that you're looking at a bird whose range overlaps with the location you're at. Time of year is also important to pay attention to concerning the range maps. Since some species migrate and are only in your local area for part of the year, these would be the birds that spend their summer and breeding season here in Saskatchewan, for example. Conversely, there are birds that spend their summers further north, and southern Saskatchewan is where they spend their winter, which always blows my mind a little bit to think that we're quote unquote south for some birds, since our winters are not balmy by any means. A good example of this is cedar waxwings. So they spend their breeding season, which is summer, in southern Saskatchewan, and then they migrate further south in the fall. While Bohemian waxwings, they breed in northern forests, and then they migrate down to southern Saskatchewan for the winter. So if you see a waxwing in the summer, odds are it's a cedar waxwing. But if you see a waxwing in the winter, then it's most likely a Bohemian waxwing. There are some birds that stick around all year, and these are called residents. So those would be your chickadees, your nuthatches, birds like that. So I just wanted to briefly go over field guides. So a good field guide is your most important tool in helping you identify birds. So it is definitely worth investing in one. Field guides are arranged taxonomically, which means that the birds in the same family are grouped together, and the whole book is structured based on when different groups of birds evolved. So the more ancestral bird groups are at the front, and the groups that diverged later are more towards the back. Sometimes, especially in a new place where you're not familiar with the birds, or if you're a beginner birder, it is helpful to use these 4 criteria I've gone over to help you know where to look in your field guide. There are lots of good options for field guides out there, so you should be able to find one that you like and that works well for you. Some field guides have illustrations of the birds, while others use photographs, and which you choose often depends on which of these styles or methods works best for you. My 2 personal favorites are Sibley's Guide to Birds, which you can get for all of North America, or on a slightly smaller regional scale, so you can get birds of Western North America or Eastern. And the other one I love is National Geographic's Field Guide to Birds. There are also apps that you can get to help you with bird ID, and a couple quick examples include the Merlin app. So this is free, and it's tailored to help beginner birders learn how to ID birds. And it has the option that you can either answer a series of questions to help you get to an ID, or you can upload a photo and get a list of possible matches for the identification. Another really good app is Audubon Bird Guide, and this one is a digital field guide. So we'd use it the same way as you would a hard copy field paper book. It's also free. Both these apps are available on Apple and Android phones, and yeah, they're very handy. You do need service, so if you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's when your hard copy paper book is definitely going to save you. But yeah, I use both. I use paper and I use these apps, so all the tools. So just to wrap things up here, birdwatching is fun and it can end up becoming quite addictive, especially if you set targets for yourself to see certain numbers or types of birds. It's also enjoyable to simply observe the birds and not worry about keeping a list, just like sitting in your backyard watching your own little nature documentary. There's been recent studies come out that highlight how spending time in nature is good for people's mental and physical health, and birdwatching is a really good excuse to get outside and to be in nature. Birdwatching is definitely for everyone and is something you can tailor to suit your own style or goals, and there's no wrong or right way to enjoy birds. Personally, I've always found it rewarding to know what bird it is that I'm looking at, and again, personal opinion, I think it shows a level of respect for nature if you're willing to spend the time to learn the names of the creatures that you see. Well, that's all I have. So hopefully this has been helpful and not too overwhelming. I know that I covered a lot and I went over things fairly quickly. But again, just, work through process of elimination and you will get there. And always ask experienced birders if you have questions. Most of them are super happy to help you. So yeah, thanks for listening.